Today I'd like to take a journey through a book called Robert E. Lee and Me, A Southerner's Reckoning with the Myth of the Lost Cause by Ty Seidule. Ty was raised in the South. He is the professor emeritus of history at West Point. And there was a committee that was established at West Point to honor all those who have died in wars. And the question was raised, should we include the Confederates? These were people who had attended West Point but had participated in the Confederate cause. And Ty was reflecting on that, and in the book, of course, reflecting on his own upbringing in the South. He talks about some of the false narratives that have kind of crept into discussion about this. So, for example, Gone with the Wind, The Song of the South, Rare Rabbit, Meet Robert E. Lee. These are things that people in the South and to some extent also the North certainly have grown up with. And the question that we have to really ask is, well, why was there a civil war? Was there a civil war just because the people wanted to show off their power, their might? Why? What was the real rationale behind the Civil War? And Ty says really two things: to preserve the institution of slavery and to make sure that white supremacy was established in our country. And when you think about those two things, it gives you a different perspective on the Civil War. Not this glorious, wonderful conflict, and the soldiers were wonderful, and this was so nice, and with what they were doing, and they fought with so much courage. But why were you fighting? What were you fighting for? And I think it's very easy to lose sight of that in our discussions. We have many times made the Civil War to be so wonderful and fantastic, and we have all these Civil War battlefields, these reenactments, and it has become an accepted part of our culture that the Civil War was really a good thing, a positive thing for the South, for our country. It was great. But wait a minute, why was the Civil War fought? Ty grew up in Alexandria, Virginia, and did a little research and found that that was one of the principal places where the slave trade took place, where people would be brought from Africa and traded. He went to high school in Georgia. There was an attempt to integrate the schools, and what most people did was they said, well, we don't want to go to schools with those who are black, so they went to private academies. Also, where he grew up in Georgia, there were lynchings, and Georgia was really a racial police state, where people of a certain race, the black race, were subdued. Seidule's reaction to the marker about the lynchings in Monroe, he realized, this is right where I'm growing up here. These lynchings took place. What did it mean to be a Southern gentleman in Seidule's eyes? When he grew up, the importance was you should be a Southern gentleman. So he went to Washington and Lee College, which is the burial site for Robert E. Lee. He loved Robert E. Lee. He saw the idea of the Lee myth and Jubal Early and the Lee myth. The Charles Francis Adams Jr. gave a speech at Lee Chapel and Richmond, and in that speech he endorsed white supremacy. He said that white people are superior to black people. He said it. John Chavis also involved with this. A grant from the Ford Motor Company to kind of perpetuate this idea of white supremacy. The selling of the slaves, in memorial to Jockey John Robinson. All of this demeaning, of course, to black people. The naming of forts for Confederate soldiers and one for a plantation. What is a plantation? Ty said a plantation really is a forced labor camp. West Point, where he taught, was almost closed because of the treason during the Civil War. An oath was developed to make sure that this did not happen again because of that split that happened. Of course, those from the South leaving West Point. Resistance of the Army to integration. Why did the Army want to keep black people out? President Nixon wanted a Confederate memorial at West Point. He was, at that point, thinking of running, of course, for re-election and thought that it would be good to have this Confederate memorial there. It would help him with the Southern vote. The reaction of the black cadets to that was very strong. We don't want this. This is wrong, and so it was rejected. And Nixon had to kind of accept it because they said, well, if we do it, there's going to be an uprising. You don't want an uprising at West Point if you're the President of the United States and find out what the cause of that uprising was. So it was ultimately rejected, but the idea was advocated for very strongly by President Nixon and his Chief of Staff, Alexander Haig. What about Lee himself? His father left the family destitute. In 1852, he himself became superintendent of West Point, and he violated Article 3, Section 3 of the Constitution, which is treason, taking a position against your country. The oath that Lee took to the President of the United States and to the rules and articles of the government, he violated that. Many family members supported the Union. So we can't argue that it was just a family concern. Other colonels from Virginia stayed loyal to the Union, whereas Lee did not. Elizabeth Brown Pryor talks about General Winfield Scott, who was a Virginian. Also George Thomas, Philip St. George Cook. Of the 8 colonels from Virginia, 7 remained loyal to the Union. Why is there no monument to those who remained loyal to the Union? Why are there only monuments to Lee, who was not loyal to the Union? We include all slave states colonels who graduated from West Point, 15. 12 remained loyal to the Union, 12 of the 15. They were all from slave states, but yet their loyalties were to the Union because that was the oath that they took. Robert E. Lee violated that oath to his country. Lee resigned his commission from Virginia and quickly became a Confederate nationalist. He said the South was aggrieved by the North. There was a threat to end slavery, and so that's how he justified violating his oath to the Constitution. Lee also profited from slavery. He married Mary Custis. Enslaved labor had created her wealth, owned Arlington House, Roman Coke, and White House. Enslaved labor farms, really, because that's how they ran. They ran on the labor of their slaves. A year after his marriage, Lee inherited enslaved workers from his mother's estate. His wealth in 1846 was $1.3 million in today's dollars. His pay was about $1,700 a month in today's money. So how do you get that wealth? He was a captain in 1846. That was about $4,000 a month in today's money when he went from being a lieutenant to being a captain. He invested well in stocks and bonds, but he had many proceeds from hiring enslaved servants. As superintendent of West Point, Lee brought an enslaved servant named Burke to New York, even though in 1841 New York law had ordered all slaves freed if they had spent time in New York. During Lee's time at West Point, more enslaved people were at the academy than before or since. nearly 200 enslaved people at his residence at Arlington House. Lee got more than 2 years of administrative leave with pay, more than twice as much as any other officer during the entire antebellum period. So he was given really preferred treatment. After 1857, he spent far more time running an enslaved labor farm, 28 months, than he did with his regiment as an army officer, 13 months. So there he was, building up his wealth by a slave labor farm. Lee separated families of the enslaved. His father-in-law never did that. He whipped runaways. He intensely disliked the abolitionists. He thought that the Emancipation Proclamation would lead to the destruction of the South's social system. So he was against the Emancipation Proclamation. Lee's army captured hundreds of African Americans for forced enslavement in the South. The problem that was discussed at the time was that if African American soldiers could fight valiantly, which they did, the entire argument of slavery was bankrupt. So they didn't want them fighting. They didn't want to give them the opportunity to fight. And so there was a conflict in the South. Should we allow them to fight? If we allow them to fight, our argument about slavery is null and void, whereas in the North, they were allowed to fight. Lee's army hired thousands of enslaved workers from owners to dig fortifications and to bury dead bodies. So they were good enough to make the fortifications and to bury the dead bodies, but they could not have any other rights, and they could not fight in the army. Lee advocated for black men to be brought into the Confederate Army as soldiers, but it never materialized because it was too late in the conflict, and that was when he was running out of options. Didn't have enough men, so he said, let's bring the black people in and let them fight. But again, that would have been against their very argument that blacks were inferior to whites. 180,000 black soldiers fought for the Union. The Battle of Sailor's Creek, Lee lost nearly a fifth of his force, 8,000 soldiers, compared to 1,150 U.S. casualties, because the argument was always made that Lee was just a superior general, but certainly that battle proves that argument is not correct. The reality in terms of Lee's surrender is that he had no supplies and he had dwindling numbers. He had lost so many men. Grant had Lee surrounded. Grant believed that the war had saved the United States from slavery, an institution abhorrent to all civilized people, not brought up under it. So Grant took a strong stand against slavery. In June of 1865, Grant issued General Orders Number 108. You have maintained the Constitution and abolished slavery. So he said, you soldiers have done the right thing. You have maintained our Constitution and you have abolished slavery. They accepted defeat, but felt that he and the South had done nothing wrong. The South was defeated by overwhelming numbers. The U.S. didn't fight fair, and therefore Southern honor was still intact. And that is, of course, the great myth of the lost cause. The South was right. We were right all along. We just lost because of superior numbers, but we really are the superior ones. The South is much better than the North. White supremacy is much better than emancipation. The North was wrong in doing that. In the final campaign, Grant only had a 2-to-1 advantage in terms of numbers. Attacking forces, in terms of military strategy, usually need a 3-to-1 manpower advantage. So even that manpower argument really doesn't hold up when we compare it to battle statistics and battle strategies. Lee showed no remorse for what he had done. Never admitted that what he had done was wrong in terms of his treason, in terms of violating his oath, in terms of going against the Constitution of the United States of America. On June 7th, Lee, his 2 sons, and his nephews were indicted for treason. I'm aware of having done nothing wrong and cannot flee. Lee applied for a pardon on October 2nd, 1865. The acceptance of a pardon is an admission of guilt for the U.S. Attorney General James Speed. The pardon specifically referenced accepting the laws and proclamations with reference to the emancipation of slaves. But you must accept these. President Johnson refused to pardon him. He fell under the general amnesty that was issued on Christmas Day in 1868. After the war, Lee argued that secession was constitutional and it was okay to secede from the Union. He said the U.S. was responsible for the secession because it impeded slavery in the Western territories, that slavery should have been spread to the West, and that the United States was wrong in impeding it. After the war, Lee blamed Stuart and Ewell and actually claimed he won at Gettysburg. Lee said that blacks can't vote intelligently. Lee felt that it would be better for Virginia if she could get rid of the blacks. Lee to his son, our material, social, and political interests are naturally with the whites, and not the blacks. General Lee's letter in 1868 to the Confederate leaders, black people were needed as the laboring population, but that they had neither the intelligence nor the qualifications for political power. We will treat the Negroes with kindness, but they are inferior to us. Lee's racism. Students at Washington College routinely harassed and assaulted African Americans who made up 33% of the population while Lee was president of the college. The Freedmen's Bureau in Lexington created a schoolhouse for African Americans. Northern women who taught at the school were spat upon and denigrated with hateful remarks. Students in his college preyed on black women. Mary Lee called them lazy, idle Negroes and wished that they would go north and get out of the way. In 1840, the number of enslaved people stood at 2.5 million. By 1860, the number had grown to 4 million. The argument is frequently made, well, slavery would have just ended naturally. But when we see that type of growth, we can say it was not ending naturally, it was expanding. If the South had won, there would have been border problems in terms of slavery. What is slavery? Frederick Douglass describes it accurately. Robbed of wife, of children, of his hard earnings, of home, of friends, of society, of knowledge, and of all that makes his life desirable. That's what slavery is. And that's the institution that Lee and those who went with him were fighting to maintain in our country. That is the reality. When we look at the history of Confederate monuments, they represent a racist legacy. Black people could not vote with regard to the monuments. They were imposed upon them, and the rise of the Confederate monuments was congruent with the rise of the Ku Klux Klan. What is the cost to maintain those monuments? $40 million. What do we need? In order to understand this problem, we need more history and more education. We need to be studying our past. We're moving, of course, in many states in the opposite direction. We are trying not to study our past. We are trying not to understand the reality of slavery. We are making slavery and the Confederacy to be something good, something to be glorified, something to be celebrated, something that is wonderful, something that is heroic. The reality is quite the opposite. We might say, well, this is really an issue of the past. The reality is 11 states still have 22 Confederate holidays that are mandated by state law. Ty's book lays this out very well. Excellent presentation. And it shows really his own change of heart in terms of growing up as a Southern gentleman, admiring Robert E. Lee, trying to model himself on Lee, and then confronting the actual history of Lee, what Lee stood for, what Lee did, and then coming to really the opposite conclusion that these monuments to Lee are really a disservice to the reality of our country, the reality of our Constitution, what we stand for as a people, that slavery is morally reprehensible, and that it should not be celebrated in any way, shape, or form by monuments and statues.